my esteemed friends. Welcome to my channel. I am Alexander Musienko, Monday the 19th of May. And now for your attention, my traditional briefing with operational information about the events that I consider relevant, important, and worthy of your esteemed attention. As always, there is plenty to talk about. For example, the great honor bestowed upon Ukraine and the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, who was the first leader to meet with the newly enthroned, meaning officially, having assumed his holy office, Pontiff Pope Leo XIV. The meeting took place. The Pope received the President of Ukraine, the First Lady, and there was also a meeting with the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the President's team. They discussed various topics, but of course, the primary focus was the Russian-Ukrainian war. And here it's important to understand the following point. Right now, commentators and very interesting analysts are writing about what the foreign policy of Pope Leo XIV will be. He will play an active role. He is planning to visit Nicaea, soon. Nicaea is the place where 1700 years ago a council took place, one of the first councils. And this is a very important event. It is quite possible that perhaps the new Pope will come to Ukraine directly from there. Overall, as noted by the teacher authors of the publication, such as D. Kiel and others, when comparing the new Pope to the previous one, here is what they say. Francis's anti-American rhetoric, that is the previous Pope, and his compromising Eastern policy toward Russia and China indicated papal support for a certain neutrality toward them and a policy of confrontation with the West. But Russia and China treated the Vatican as a tool and used it as a basis for pursuing their aggressive policies. It is unlikely that the Vatican will continue on this course, abandoning the discredited Eastern policy toward Russia and China, as well as the anti-American bias in Vatican policy, would give the new Pope a chance to unite with the West, not only in Ukraine, but also in the global South. This would be a significant step toward peace in the world. In other words, the Pope will be more oriented toward, let's say, the values that are being discussed, namely that it is necessary to support the rule of law, to uphold democracy, and to ensure these things directly in the world. And of course, it is necessary to contain aggressive regimes like the Russian one. That's for sure, and that's a good signal. So the Vatican will play its role. The presence of many leaders who are coming, royal families, presidents, governments, shows that the Catholic Church still has influence, especially in the global South, and that's a large part of the population. This also includes, among others, some of Russia's allies. So for us, entering through the back door as partners, specifically entering through the back door into places where Russia has operated, where China has tried to establish itself, is important. Well, that's important for us too. It's also about seeking support. So I hope that will be the case. That's why I specifically highlight and emphasize the significance of this event, the visit of the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, to the enthronement and the meeting there with the Pontiff. Moreover, he was the first leader with whom the Pope met. This is a great honor for Ukraine, for the President, and we must remember this. I hope it will mark a new chapter in our relations with the Vatican and the role I mentioned, that we will be able to sway some of the former allies and supporters who cooperated with Putin and Russia more towards a position in support of Ukraine. In my opinion, this is important and it is not unrealistic. This is what needs to be understood. In addition, the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, held a meeting with the Vice President of the United States of America and the Secretary of State, who also serves as President Trump's national security advisor, Mark Rubio. There were no longer any scandalous situations or outbursts. The meeting took place in a much better atmosphere than what happened on February 28th at the White House. Back then, I want to remind you, It was J.D. Vance who started with such reproaches that were, in my opinion, absolutely unfair, somewhat clumsy, and of a provocative nature, openly provocative, towards the President of Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. And by the way, our response at that time was exactly what it should have been in that situation. We are united, we are consolidated, we stood up to defend Ukraine. We put a stop to any internal political squabbles, and perhaps regardless of our political preferences, we still came together and supported our Supreme Commander-in-Chief, President of Ukraine Zelenskyy, as well as the Ukrainian people and our state as a whole. This is an example, by the way, for which I am proud of all of you, of our entire Ukrainian people who know how to unite in such moments. And this is one of the ways in which we are different. This is yet another trait that distinguishes us from the Russians. Therefore, such qualities must be preserved, nurtured, and further developed. And this is how the President of Ukraine assessed this meeting. He noted that Ukraine is ready for genuine diplomacy and calls for the swiftest, complete, and unconditional ceasefire. Also, as the President of Ukraine noted, they touched upon the need for sanctions against Russia, bilateral trade, defense cooperation, the situation on the battlefield, and the future exchange of prisoners. The President also emphasized the need to continue putting pressure on Russia until it is ready to stop the war. And of course, we discussed our joint steps toward achieving a just and lasting peace. Thank you to the entire American people for your support and leadership in saving lives, Volodymyr. Zelenskyy concluded. Well, regarding sanctions, by the way, it's interesting to note here that the US Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessent, points out that in his opinion, American sanctions have proven to be insufficiently effective against Russia. Well, of course, we can see that because the war is ongoing, Russian aggression continues, which means that sanctions, as one of the main ways, at least as they were presented to us, of holding Russia accountable as a violator of international law, have not fully justified themselves and have not worked as we would have liked. Bessent says that in principle he already knows the reason. And from an economic and financial point of view, he understands why things turned out in this way and what needs to be done. In particular, as noted, Biden was afraid of a significant drop in oil prices, and not only that. And accordingly, that was one of the reasons, and not the only one. That is, Bessent and the current US presidential administration understand what needs to be done. Well, I hope they are working on the necessary measures, because Russia is stalling for time, because Putin is continuing the war, because Putin keeps launching Shaheds at Ukrainian cities, because we are being threatened with launches. As I warned the day before, relaying the official message from the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense, they threaten, intimidate, and blackmail everyone with another Russian Wunderwaffe that they might launch, and so on. That's why the Kremlin continues to behave aggressively, and of course, this needs to be stopped. We'll see. Today, in many ways, the 19th of May, well, I won't say it's decisive, but it's also a day when a lot of I's can be dotted. In what sense? Well, in the sense that it will be possible to understand what happens next. Trump is supposed to have a phone conversation with the Russian dictator Putin. Similarly, the American leader is also scheduled to have a phone conversation with the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelenskyy. And of course, the possible next steps will be in the spotlight. According to the American publication Politico, citing unnamed sources within Ukrainian diplomacy and administration, there are concerns in Ukraine that Trump and Putin might reach some unfavorable agreements, use behind our backs, and then start pushing them on us, including by using various pressure mechanisms. The fear is that we might end up going in circles and once again face a situation like Kyiv before, when the United States suspended its assistance to us and then stopped providing the intelligence information we so desperately need. These are the main concerns and apprehensions on our side, and they are not unfounded. Once again, this is based on our previous historical experience. That is why I still hope that the president of Ukraine, who is now conducting, well, despite everything, we are pursuing the right policy, it is constructive. We are talking to the State Department, talking to the Vice President, talking to senators, to American officials, and we are also engaging our European partners who are speaking on our behalf to President Trump. In other words, a comprehensive set and algorithm of actions is being used in order to present our position in the best possible way, to defend and uphold our interests, just as our soldiers do through their heroic, selfless struggle and daily painstaking work on the battlefield, so too do our diplomats, led by the President of Ukraine. So we are waiting to see what news will come from these phone conversations. Again, it is not worth immediately expecting any major potential breakthroughs after this, or assuming that Russia will be ready to agree to a ceasefire right away. But once again, this will mark the ongoing nature of the negotiation process. You can see how long and complicated all of this is. It began at the end of February, and now it's already the second half of May. Yet in some areas, things are still at a standstill. You have to agree. Well, that's the situation. I mentioned this earlier and explained the reasons why it would be this way. One of the reasons, the main one, is that Russia is not interested in ending the war. Putin doesn't know how to get out of it without losing his internal political support, without losing that, fabricated image of machismo, the leader, the dictator, a figure that others fear, someone who can intimidate, and so on. And because of this, of course, that's the main reason why it's being dragged out. Well, and besides that, the US Secretary of State is speaking, Marco Rubio. He expressed the belief that the only way to advance negotiations between Ukraine and Russia is a personal meeting between Trump and Putin. As the American Secretary of State noted, the president has publicly proposed to hold a personal meeting. Organizing such a meeting requires certain efforts. Therefore, I can't say that the choice of location and date is already being planned at this time. But the president wants this. He wants to do it as soon as possible, Rubio replied. He said this in an interview with CBS News. Well, Rubio still answered somewhat diplomatically. That is, he didn't offend Trump, emphasized that the American president truly wants such a meeting. And at the same time, there's this phrase, organizing such a meeting requires certain efforts. So I can't say that at this point the location and date are already being planned. Well, it's obvious that Rubio is hinting that such a meeting can't just happen out of the blue. And apparently, the positions of Russia and the US at the stage of preparing for such a possible potential meeting are so far apart from each other that they require resolution and settlement first, and only then can we talk about actually reaching any kind of meeting. But we wouldn't want that to happen. Although this is what Putin wants. It must be said frankly that this is what Putin wants. It is his dream. It is his aspiration for America to sit down with Russia and discuss the fate of the world. Taking into account, as he constantly says, the security issues that concern Russia and that could threaten Russia's territorial integrity. But who is encroaching on it? It is they who are encroaching and pushing their neo-imperial wars. Well, meanwhile, Friedrich Merz, the German chancellor, has started speaking quite actively. For example, he called on Italy to get more involved in resolving Russia's war against Ukraine. The German chancellor believes that Italy should play a greater role in European efforts to end Russia's war against Ukraine. Merz's remarks came after a meeting with Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni in Rome. We agreed that Italy should play a certain role, Merz said. He also announced that in the coming days he would continue talks with other European partners. We must not allow ourselves to be divided within the European Union. There are no first or second class members here, the Chancellor emphasized. And this statement is reported by Germany's Deutsche Welle. Well, indeed, one can only agree with that. We can see how Merz is trying to take on increasingly leading roles, and define his position as a leader in Europe. But the question is simply this. If Italy is ready to supply Ukraine with 400 M113 armored personnel carriers in the near future, then the question for Friedrich Merz is, where are the 400 German-made Marder armored vehicles? And where, for example, are the German Panzerhaubitze artillery pieces? Or ultimately, what is happening with the long-range Taurus missiles, which we desperately need to destroy the enemy's rear and logistics? That, in fact, is the question. I think we would also like to hear an answer to it. And I hope that our German partners will be consistent in this regard when they call on their colleagues and friends from the European Union to play a greater role, to provide more support and assistance to Ukraine. They will serve, they will not just call for action, but will set an example of how it should be done. Well, Finnish President Alexander Stubb reported on a phone conversation with the leaders of the US and Ukraine that took place the day before. And according to Stubb, on Saturday evening, he had a lengthy conversation with US President Trump, and on Sunday morning with Ukrainian President Zelenskyy. Zelenskyy is patient, but Trump is starting to lose patience, though in the right direction, that is, toward Putin. The president of Finland summed up the outcome of the conversation. The president of Finland also expressed confidence that despite the fluctuations in international diplomacy over the past 2 weeks, the situation for Ukraine has changed for the better. Here is an external assessment, in particular of the efforts of Ukrainian diplomacy and the leadership of the Ukrainian president, as provided by Finnish President Stubb. In other words, this is an external position that can truly be considered, among other things, objective. Meanwhile, Russia continues to destabilize part of Romania. Remember, I even had a separate video where I explained that the Kremlin's plans are not just about restoring the Soviet Union. Their plan is the Russian Empire. And this is just one part of the plan. It is supposed to include the Baltic countries, Bessarabia, Moldova, part of Romania as well, as the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Poland. In other words, Bulgaria and other states would become satellites. And the second goal is to break the unity of NATO and the European Union. The Kremlin would be very pleased if, in addition to Slovakia and Hungary, Romania also became a country that stirred up trouble, that is, held back or slowed down the decision-making of the North Atlantic Alliance, was in no hurry, put a spoke in their wheels, made statements, visited Putin for parades on May 9th, and so on and so forth. And that's why at first Russia placed its bet on the pro-Russian candidate Georgescu, who was detained along with his group of like-minded associates and colleagues on charges of committing criminal offenses, including suspicion of treason specifically for collaborating with Russian intelligence. And now the situation is different because, in fact, it has been established in Romania that in the second round of the presidential elections, the victory goes to the pro-European candidate and supporter of continuing aid to Ukraine, Nicu Șordan. And George Simeon, the pro-Russian candidate who spoke out against NATO and so on, loses the election. But in fact, Simeon does not accept this. He addresses his supporters, his followers, publicly, and almost starts urging them to take to the streets, essentially trying to organize a kind of pro-Russian Maidan. We'll see how the situation develops here. But the fact that the winning candidate is a supporter of the West, a supporter of Ukraine, someone who does not accept and condemns Russia for its aggression against Ukraine, is a very good sign for us. So I will be watching these events and others as they unfold. And in the meantime, please subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to like and leave your comments so that our wonderful community of amazing people keeps growing, becomes larger, multiplies, and we continue working together for the sake of our Ukraine. Take care of yourselves and glory to Ukraine.